Now we're going to move on to the main section of the meeting. First, I'll quickly take you through the structure of the meeting. Our speaker will talk for around 30 to 40 minutes. After that, we'll break out into smaller groups for 10 minutes using the Zoom breakout function. There we can discuss some of the things that Deepa, our speaker, has raised, and collectively come up with some more questions for one question per group. Then we'll come back and have a Q&A that will run until about 7:30 p.m. A few housekeeping details quickly. Please make sure that your microphone is muted at all times. This reduces the problem of feedback and means everyone will have a better experience. For most of you, that will be a button in your bottom left of your screen. Quickly, many of you might have heard about people disrupting Zoom meetings. I just want to let you know we've taken a number of precautions to prevent this, and we have a security team on hand to eject anyone from the meeting if that, in the unlikely case that it happens, that will happen. So just bear with us. So I've got the great pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, Professor Deepa Kumar. Deepa is a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, where she was also the president of the faculty union, the AFT-AAUP. Deepa is a leading thinker on topics of racism, Islamophobia, and imperialism. She's written for Jacobin, as well as a host of academic and non-academic publications. She's also the author of the fantastic book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, that I'd recommend to everyone. So, Deepa, away.
Thank you, Pete, for that generous introduction. I just want to say about Neil Davidson, that was a beautiful tribute, and for people in Scotland, just to let you know that he had many friends and comrades here in the United States, and he will be sorely missed. So let me pull up. Hang on a second, I can't seem to find my presentation.
No worries, take your time.
Okay, so this is a little bit challenging. I've never done a Zoom presentation with PowerPoint and with my notes in Word sitting somewhere there. So we'll try to do the best we can. There we are. Can you see it? Okay, great. So two firsts that I am attempting today. The first is, of course, trying to do the Zoom presentation with a PowerPoint, and let's hope that works out. Second, I've actually never given a presentation to a Scottish audience before, perhaps because I don't know very much about Scottish history or politics, so I really look forward to learning from you. So the topic is racism, capitalism, and imperialism. And let me begin by making a very basic point, which is that there is no such thing as race, right? We know this. There is no genetic or biological evidence for the existence of races. Races are produced at particular moments to serve particular ends. And this is known as racial formation or simply racialization. And what's happening is that a group of people are being turned into a race for a particular reason. Now, the modern understanding, the modern conception of race is site-oriented or phenotypical. And so race refers to physical characteristics, to skin color, shape of eyes, various other facial features, hair texture, or article of religious clothing, such as hijabs or kippas. This is not to say, of course, that people who are phenotypically white, like the Irish or the Italians or Eastern Europeans and so on, have not been racialized in the United States in particular, but certainly elsewhere. But that for the most part, we know race because we, quote unquote, see it, right? And we create this essentialized other who we understand through a handful of characteristics. Okay, so these characteristics, if you look at them, right, skin color, shape of eyes, and so on, they're really arbitrary. So when I teach about this in my classes, what I say is, you know, everyone who's under 5 feet 5 inches tall, can you raise your hand? And about, you know, I don't know, about half of the class raises their hands, as do I, because I'm a short person. And I make the point that there isn't a shorty race, right? There is no tallie race, there is no shorty race. In other words, it is not the case that every marker of difference becomes the basis of othering, and that there is no tendency within human beings when they see these markers of difference to automatically other people, right? So I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And again, the modern idea of races must be understood as being produced at certain historic moments to serve particular ends. Okay, so I want to try to do three things in my talk today. First, I'm going to lay out in broad brushstrokes some of the ways in which Marxists and socialists have thought about race and racism and outline some bodies of thought. I'll briefly talk about a method about how to think about racial formation. And finally, I will apply that to an analysis of how Arabs and later Muslims in the United States are turned into racialized groups, particularly in the context of the turn to neoliberalism in the early 70s, but certainly later on with the war on terror. Okay, so one caveat before I begin, my talk is American-centric. And in a way, that's not a bad thing, because after all, New World slavery and settler colonialism are key motors in the production of modern racism. I'll be talking a little bit about the UK and France when I'm talking about colonialism, but I won't be saying very much more about that as it applies to Ireland, for instance, or Scotland. And I'm really hoping, as I said earlier, to learn from you and to have this be a collaborative process by which we can all increase our understanding of race and racism. So let's begin then with what Marx himself had to say about race. This is from Capital, and this is one of the most oft quoted, things that Marx has written about this subject. And he says, quote, "In the United States of America, every independent workers' movement was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin." And so Marx argued that capitalism was grounded in slavery and that racism blunted class consciousness among workers from the dominant groups. And of course, there's a caricature of Marx that, he had nothing to say about race, and that, all that Marx stood for was a question of class, and that's not true. In fact, I would recommend Kevin Anderson's book, Marx at the Margins, where he argues that Marx wrote not only about class, but also nationalism, race, ethnicity, and so forth. At any rate, this notion that Marx put forward, that racism is a tool that's used to divide the working class, is one that gets taken up by Marxists and socialists after him. So W.E.B. Du Bois, for instance, in his book, Black Reconstruction, hold on, let me not go to that quote before I'm ready to read it. So W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book, Black Reconstruction, argues that in the slave plantation system in the South, poor whites were brought into an identification with the planter elite by being given positions of authorities over blacks, such as overseers, as slave drivers, as members of slave patrols, and so forth. And so with this associated feeling of superiority, what happens is that their hatred for the wider plantation system that actually impoverishes them is displaced onto black and enslaved people. So what's going on is that class antagonism was racialized and turned into a pillar of stability for the slave plantation system. And Du Bois used the term psychological wage to describe this sense of superiority granted to non-elite whites in the South. And here's how he put it. Quote, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they receive a low wage, were compensated by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts dependent under their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. On the other hand, in the same way, the Negro was subject to public insult, was afraid of mobs, was liable to the jibes of children and the unreasoning fears of white women, and was compelled almost continuously to submit to various badges of inferiority. The result of this was that wages of both classes could be kept low. The whites fearing to be supplanted by Negro labor, the Negroes always being threatened by the substitution of white labor. So this is classic divide and rule, right? They divided both to conquer each, is the argument that W.E.B. Du Bois makes. Now, David Roediger builds on Du Bois's analysis in a book called The Wages of Whiteness, and he looks at 19th century US labor history to show all of the instances where white workers chose to act against Black workers rather than acting in solidarity with them. But in doing so, however, he sort of more or less offers the proposition that interracial solidarity was nigh impossible. And for that reason, the book has come under a lot of critique for being pessimistic, and in fact, even for misrepresenting Du Bois's argument, because Du Bois, like Marx before him, insisted that solidarity was possible, and further, that the benefits of racism didn't actually flow to white workers, even if there was some, small privileges, if you will, granted, but that it really went to the ruling class. At any rate, I mention this book because I want to talk about a tradition that comes out of Roediger, as well as Theodore Allen and Noel Ignatieff and other socialists who were writing in the 60s and 70s about white privilege. Today, that means something completely different. At the time, it was much more Marxist and socialist in its orientation. And we see the formation of what's known as critical whiteness studies. It's a very productive body of work. And actually, along that line, I would recommend Roediger's Working Towards Whiteness, which is about how Eastern European and Southern European immigrants who move in large numbers to the United States back at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, how they get racialized, but then eventually accepted into whiteness after World War II. If nothing else, it's very useful in terms of an understanding of how races are produced at certain moments and for certain reasons. And by the way, it's also the case that Syrian Christians who immigrated to the US at the time are racialized, but then get accepted into whiteness after the Second World War. So I have a few caricatures and cartoons to help people see the ways in which the Irish as well as the Italians were racialized. So here's one. Can you see the caption? The most recently discovered wild beast, and presumably the person in the cage is Irish, right? So dehumanization. This happens before the racialization of the Eastern and Southern Europeans, right? Because the Irish are the first mass race. We see the same here. There's a comparison. The person on the left is African-American. The person on the right is Irish, presumably equally bad because, those are the scales on which they are on. And here we have Italians. The slurs that were used were Dago and Wop, right? And you see that he's of a slightly darker complexion. And finally, here's from 1903, America, unrestricted dumping ground. If you see on the bottom right corner, that's the mafia, the person, the rat wearing the hat, which says mafia, is presumably a representation of Italians. The others, because they're wearing sombreros, we can assume are Mexican possibly, or other Latin American immigrants. So all of this is taking place around the turn of the 19th and start of the 20th century. At any rate, this is a long way to say that there has been a productive strand of thinking about how divide and rule has been a key way in which racism can be understood. And it's certainly an important mechanism, but I want to say that it is not the only venue of racial formation. So too often in the US, when leftists talk about the origins of racism, the discussion begins and ends with slavery and the discussion and the legacy of slavery. And indigenous rights activists and indigenous studies scholars have actually offered a really important corrective, right? Which is to say that capitalism not only needs to discipline and exploit labor, but it also needs land to reproduce itself. And the settler colonial mission and westward expansion in the United States was really the key venue, the key producing grounds for anti-Native American racism. So I have some images of that too. So you see here, you know, sort of literally the reversal of history. Here, you know, you've got, I mean, the real story of the conquest of the United States and the formation of the United States of America is the genocide of Native people, right? The mass murder of Native people. And here you have the reversal of these finely dressed English gentlemen, presumably being lynched by these supposed barbarians, right? That was the rhetoric that was developed, that Native Americans are barbaric, heathen, uncivilized, and therefore not worthy of keeping their lands. So here's another one. There's a gender dynamic here, and this has a long history, which is that white women are in danger from the lust of Native men. This is, by the way, a trope that gets used again and again. It's used after the Civil War to create the myth of the Black rapist and so forth. So yeah, there is the development of an ideology to justify westward expansion and the settler colonial project. But I want to emphasize that racism is not just an ideology. Racism is best understood as an ideology and a practice. I understand that some of you are doing a study group on Gramsci, and just as people like to sort of capture the notion of hegemony as coercion plus consent, I think one way to think about racism is ideology plus practice. So to summarize very quickly, race is not a biological category, as I said earlier, but an ideology. However, race is not simply an ideology, it is also a set of practices. In other words, it relies on structural discriminatory practices which are baked into institutions. Slavery is one such practice, dispossession is another. In other words, it is both exploitation and expropriation that inform projects of racial formation. And the way that indigenous studies scholar Patrick Wolf puts it is that race is, quote, not a singular or unified project, but a hydra-headed assortment of local practices. In other words, it doesn't look the same or feel the same or have the same logic when it applies to various different groups. So let's take the example of the one drop of blood rule, right? So if you had one drop of African ancestry, that made you Black in this country. And of course, that was helpful in terms of justifying people's enslavement. And in the post, emancipation period, in the Jim Crow South, which is where there was a segregation of all public spaces. Again, this kind of logic enabled those practices. But for Native Americans, it was the exact opposite logic, right? So any amount of Native ancestry, when combined with whites, even one drop, compromised one's native status, right? These were known as blood quantum laws. And the reason that this logic made sense, at least from the point of view of the system, was that then people were denied any rights to the land that their people had lived on for thousands of years. And there are some court cases as well that are informative. Here, I want to, just sort of stress the point about why race is not just an ideology, and racism is not just an ideology, but it's baked into institutions such as the law, for instance. So there are two cases I want to talk about. One is Cherokee v. Georgia. The Cherokee people had lived in the state of Georgia for thousands of years. However, once the United States was formed, they were stripped of citizenship. They became non-citizens with few rights other than the right to live in Georgia. I mean, think of the profound irony, right? The people who've inhabited the land, the settler colonial mission is complete, and of course they're denied citizenship. At any rate, even that right to live on the land is one that the state of Georgia sought to remove from them and to push them out westward. And so the Cherokee Nation sought a federal injunction and tried to adjudicate this matter in that way. The case never even went to trial because the judge ruled that the Cherokees were a quote-unquote dependent nation with a relationship to the United States like wards to its guardian. In other words, they were reduced to children, right? The way that one judge put it is there's no plaintiff in the case. Just as children can't bring lawsuits, right? So Native American people could not bring this lawsuit. They were dehumanized, they were infantilized, and the case didn't even make it to trial. You see the same sort of non-citizenship in the case of African Americans, even in the case of slaves who lived in area where slavery was prohibited. This is the Dred Scott v. Sanford case of 1857. And the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, who resided in a free state and territory where slavery was in fact prohibited, was not entitled to his freedom, and that African Americans were not and could not ever be citizens of the United States. Okay. All right, I don't know where my notes are at this point, but I'll just keep going. Okay, so I want to then turn to the question of method and how to understand racial formation. I think some of the best work is by Barbara and Karen Fields in this book called Racecraft, if you haven't read it. And the way that Fields and Fields put it is that racism is first and foremost a social practice, which means that it is an action and a rationale for action, or both at once, right? So this is the emphasis that I've been giving in this talk as well, is it's a set of practices, it's a set of social practices, which sometimes are accomplished, which are set in stone immediately with a racist ideology, and at other times takes a much longer time. So the Barbara Fields' argument is that the anti-Black ideology develops in the decades and in fact even centuries after the practice of slavery is institutionalized. And interestingly, I found the same to be true when it comes to the racialization of Arabs as terrorists in particular, and I'll come to that shortly. So to continue with the work of Fields and Fields, they say, while racism always takes for granted the objective reality of race, this is a sleight of hand as it transforms racism, something the aggressor does, into race, something the target is, right? So racism sort of naturalizes races when in fact we know that races don't exist. So to sum up the method, on the left, I have what is my favorite quote from Barbara Fields. This is her piece in New Left Review, where she basically says that historians think of slavery in the United States as primarily a system of race relation, as though the chief business of slavery were the production of white supremacy as ideology, rather than the production of cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. So it's a very materialist understanding of the rise of racism rooted in the needs of capital and the slave plantation system and so forth. And certainly cotton particularly is a very important input for industrial production in the UK. And industrialization in the UK, gives slavery a new lease of life in the United States. And so racist ideas to justify this massive expansion and dehumanization of African Americans is very much tied to the system of capitalism, slavery, industrialization, and so forth. So race and racism are historically contingent projects that come out of material contexts to state that race is socially constructed, which is the more postmodern take, only gets us so far. What is important, says Patrick Wolf, is how races are constructed, under what circumstances, and in whose interests, right? So that's the method that I follow. Before I go into my analysis of Terrorcraft, I want to say a little bit about colonialism. Now, many theorists have argued that race is a modern phenomenon, even if some of the ideas that inform modern notions of race can be found in the Middle Ages or even before that. And people have argued that the Enlightenment, or the intellectual and philosophical movement in Europe of the 17th and 18th century, actually laid the basis for modern notions of race. And Wolf argues that while religion justified colonialism in the 16th and 17th century, it's not just Wolf, this is widely accepted, race became the organizing grammar of particularly 19th century colonialism. And he says this was precipitated by the shift towards an industrial economy. So to go to this slide, in the 16th and 17th century, the exploitation of native people in the New World was condoned by arguing that Indian quote unquote savages were idolaters, that is to say they were idol worshippers. And of course, this was the worst thing you can be in the Middle Ages. And therefore God had ordained that they be enslaved by Christians. Similarly, the enslavement of Africans was also justified through the book of Genesis, the myth of the curse of Ham or Canaan. And it was said that their skin color their skin was dark because it marked the curse. So even after they converted to Christianity, they could still be retained as slaves because, they were cursed, right? So you see all these justifications, very convenient justifications for this kind of dehumanization. But there's a shift, as I said earlier, in the 18th century after the Enlightenment to scientific justifications based on notions developed in the Enlightenment and with the growth of science. So scientists like Carl Linnaeus and Blumenbach divided human beings into various races with distinct characteristics. So Blumenbach established a fivefold schema: white, red, black, brown, and yellow. And what flowed from such characterizations, particularly in the context of colonialism, was that white Europeans were seen as superior and the other darker people were either ugly at best or semi-civilized, right? So these are some of the ways in which these others were scientifically understood, right? You see skull drawings here. This is from a book called Types of Mankind. And you see at the bottom, there's an ape. And right above that is a dark-skinned man, presumably African, but certainly this could be a darker-skinned person from South Asia as well. And over that is Apollo, by the way, Apollo, the Greek god. And this is actually a sketch of the statue of Apollo. So in fact, he doesn't, presumably he doesn't have a skull, but he's the ideal man. But you get the idea. There is a hierarchy being established with brown and black people obviously being closer to the ape than to the ideal, which is the white race represented by the Greek god Apollo. And of course, if that's your way of understanding different human beings, their capacities, their mental capacities, their skull shapes, and so on, it flows from that whites had the burden to go off and civilize these benighted masses. And in fact, you see that very clearly in advertising, for instance. This is from Anne McClintock's book, Imperial Leather, Pear's Soap. Do you still have Pear's Soap in the UK? Presumably you do. Anyway, Pear's Soap, you see the copy here. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. And so Pear's Soap comes in as a way to wash these masses. And by the way, I'll take a little quick segue here to say that currently in the United States, we have seen a massive ratcheting up of racism against East Asians, right? And that's very consciously orchestrated by Trump and the right wing. They're calling this the Chinese virus and not the coronavirus. And there's a reason for that. It's geopolitical in the sense of, China being the enemy of the United States. And there's certainly a longer history of this in terms of China being the enemy going back to the early 1990s. But it draws on earlier notions of yellow peril, which comes into being in the middle of the 19th century in the United States. And part of the argument is that these people are dirty, right? They bring with them disease. They bring with them things that murk up, that muddy up the body politic, if you will. So these ideas are everywhere. They're not just ideas of the British Empire. They're certainly part of the narrative of the American Empire as well. And here's another one from British context. So here you see this white baby using transparent soap to whiten a black baby, right? The white boy's burden, we might say. And of course, as much as he may be whitened, his face still remains dark because he can never quite fully be white, right? So half devil, half child is the way that Rudyard Kipling put it at the turn of the century. Now, in case you think that these sorts of blatantly racist ideas are part of ancient history, think again. The British-Dutch multinational Unilever ran this ad in 2017. Right, a beautiful black woman uses Dove lotion and becomes white because that's apparently what she should be doing. Okay, so that's as much as I'm going to say about slavery, colonialism, settler colonialism, setting the context for the birth of modern racism. I'm now going to pivot to my own work on anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism. This is actually a tiny, tiny part of what I'm going to say today, that is a tiny part of a paper that is coming out in the journal Race and Class in July. So, and the editors have been kind enough to make it available for a few months to anyone who wants to read it. It's not going to be behind a paywall. So if anyone's interested in this piece, perhaps Pete can share it when it comes out to this group of people. So very quickly, because I know I've been taking a lot of time, probably another 5 or 10 minutes. Pete, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. 5 if possible. Okay.
So Terrorcraft is what I'm calling this process of Arab and Muslim racial formation. Obviously, in the post 9/11 world, terrorism is overwhelmingly associated with Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians, so much so it has become common sense. But this has not always been the case. As I said earlier, Arab Americans were integrated into whiteness just as their Eastern and Southern European counterparts were in the post-World War II period. But the social, economic, and political crises of the late 60s and 70s actually shifted the situation and laid the basis for the racialized terrorist threat. So what's going on briefly in the United States? One, economically, the US is losing its hegemony on the global stage. It's facing competition from Germany and Japan. US share of world trade and manufacturing begins a process of decline. Bretton Woods, the agreement is called to an end. There's the oil shocks in 1973. So there's a massive economic crisis that the US is in the throes of. At the same time, There is also a political crisis because it's losing the war in Vietnam. And there's a massive anti-war movement in the United States that is, so both abroad and in the United States, empire is in crisis at this moment. And it was not just an anti-war movement that we saw in this country. There was also a civil rights movement, which had become the Black Power movement by the end of the 60s, feminist movement, gay liberation movement, and so forth, right? So that was the social crisis that marked this period. And so why and when are Arabs turned into racialized threats? This is the context, right? The crisis. But particularly, it was after the 67 Arab-Israeli war, with the development of an Arab left, the second generation of immigrants who come to the US after the Second World War come here with ideas of nationalism, Arab nationalism, and with ideas of anti-imperialism. And the 67 war is a really important moment for the formation of left groups in the United States, particularly Arab American left groups. And these groups would now start to have relationships with the broader anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist left, particularly groups like SNCC and the Black Panthers, all of whom supported the Palestinian side over the Israeli side after the 1967 war. So here's how Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it. She says, from the Ellie Watts uprising onwards, radical Black, brown, yellow, and red power movements fought the ways the state organized poor people's perpetual dispossession in service to capital. Radical white activists, students, wage workers, welfare rights agitators added to domestic disorders by aligning with people of color. So here you have it, right? Multiracial organizing. They also launched autonomous attacks against symbols and strongholds of US capitalism and Euro-American racism and imperialism. And this was a massive threat to US political and economic hegemony. In particular, the thinking at the time was that the Arab left should not be allowed to create the kind of movement that the anti-Vietnam War movement had, sparked, because if it did, then the US would lose its ability to have control over oil resources in the Middle East, and that had to be prevented, using whatever means necessary. And the means really were counterinsurgency methods, right? So counterinsurgency is basically a way in which, before a threat can fully develop, it is stymied, it is, put back into the bottle, as it were. And this is something that the US had been using internationally ever after, since the Second World War. And the imperial states expanding policing capacity around the world coincided with the same tactic of incarceration being used domestically. And so, hold on, before I go there. And so what happens after 67 is that the FBI and so on and other state agencies start to surveil and racially profile Arab Americans, particularly the Arab American left, right? And so what happens is in the process of doing that, they create a racialized other, which gets ratcheted up after the 1972 Munich incident. What happens in Munich is that Palestinian activists in the group Black September take Israeli athletes hostage at the Munich Olympics, and then in the context of a botched rescue operation, murder all the Israeli athletes. And that sends a certain kind of message on the global stage about terrorism and who the terrorist is. But in the United States, there was no policy around terrorism, and there was no vocabulary around terrorism. But the Nixon administration actually launches a whole series of initiatives based on the logic that the violence of a small group of Palestinians in Munich furnishes the grounds from which to racially profile all Arab Americans, right? So an essentialized and racialized Arab other was created through coercive state policies, things like racial profiling, surveillance, visa checking, interviewing, and so on. To the security establishment, Munich demonstrated the quote-unquote potential that Arab Americans possessed for terrorism in general. Now you think about this, when whites commit such mass murder, particularly in the United States, there are no policies to systematically go after and surveil and get information and, profile white men. That's not what happens, but this is what happened to Arabs post 1972. And this is also the moment, the early 1970s, when the carceral state, right? People know that the US imprisons more people as a percentage of the population than any other country in the world. This is also the moment that the carceral state is being built based on the idea of Black criminals, Black criminality. Of course, the precursors go back earlier, but nevertheless, this is a pivotal moment. And it's not a coincidence that the Arab terrorist and the Black criminal are created at the same time, because this is also the moment of the rise of neoliberalism, right? When the US goes into economic crisis and the last forms of Keynesian methods to resolve the crisis fail, the neoliberal ideas come to the fore. And neoliberalism, right from its start, is based on authoritarian modes of controlling dissent, right? Think about Chile, think about where neoliberalism was first introduced with Pinochet in power. And in the UK, Stuart Hall and his co-authors in Policing the Crisis really, that's one of the first analysis of how racism becomes a way of policing the crisis, of creating authoritarian solutions and of increasing the powers of the state to police dissent. So I'll come to a close with this. Why does such a historical materialist understanding of racism matter? Well, first and foremost, if race is not biological, but socially constructed, and if racism is a historically contingent project, then having such an analysis allows us to imagine ways of ending racism, right? If we believe that somehow any marker of difference, such as skin color, biologically programs all of us to hate one another, and that racism has always been with us and will always be with us, then we lose the ability to actually fight it and to end it. And so I'm going to use the words of the Fields sisters again, when they say race is not an idea, but an ideology. It came into existence at a discernible historic moment for rationally understandable reasons and is subject to change for similar reasons. In other words, it is subject to being ended. And I think it's that kind of notion of ending racism, ending capitalism, and ending imperialism that certainly animates my work and my activism, and I hope you share that too. Thank you.
I'm going to take a few questions at a time. So I'm also going to ask Bridget and Samina to speak. And also, actually, I should have mentioned this before. Just before you do speak, maybe you could introduce yourself and just let us know who you are and where you're from. Okay, so Bridget next.
Sorry, am I muted?
I've unmuted you now.
Can you hear me? Yeah. We felt a little plea. We enjoyed the talk very much. Could we have a little bit longer for breakout groups? So we find an amount of time very constricting. What we wanted to ask a bit more about was the relationship between the racialization, the construction of race, and various historical events. And we were particularly thinking that perhaps there ought to be more emphasis on colonization as itself a process which racializes those who have been dispossessed of their land. For example, the Xhosa in South Africa, or Zulus, and those who are then exploited and oppressed, forced into production of raw materials, rather than allowed to go on with their artisan industry, etc. In the case of China, Chinese form of colonization, you might think of the Opium War creating an image of Chinese as pathetic opium users with no intelligence, etc. in the case of America, the way in which Mexicans are racialized through American de facto colonization. And we wondered whether you had any observations about that. So before, say, Asian people come to Scotland, they've already been racialized, we're suggesting, via colonization.
Thanks very much, Bridget. And on your first point about extending the time in the breakout rooms, we'll definitely take that on board and make sure we've got more time. I'm going to take one more question just now, and then I'll let Deepa come back on all of these incredibly interesting detailed questions that have been asked. So I'll ask Samina, can you come in now? And then afterwards, I've got Kareem, Carolina, and Fiaz in the stack. Thanks.
Okay, hi, I'm Samina Akhtar, and I'm a PhD student at Glasgow University, actually looking at state racism. So this was quite interesting for me. We talked about a few things in our group, and we came up with a question about the racialization actually of the coronavirus itself. And there's a debate going on in Britain because racialized groups, particularly Black and Asian, the Asian being in particular Pakistani and Bangladeshi populations, are about 4 times more likely to die from the virus. So there's a debate going on here about kind of almost naturalizing that in terms of there must be something genetic, and linked to that is, well, they have underlying health conditions. And what we as activists are arguing is, well, even these underlying health conditions are a product or a result of systemic inequalities, systemic racism. And also, I'm going to add a bit, we're kind of wondering, okay, we know that the similar thing is happening in America, where I can't remember exactly what the percentage or the disproportionate percentage of Black people dying from the virus is, but wondering what are the debates going on there as well, and what you've got to say about that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Samina. Deepa, do you want to come back in now?
Okay. Right, thank you for those questions. Let me take up the anti-Chinese racism and the coronavirus first, and then I'll end with the colonization question. So in terms of coronavirus deaths, 1/3 of people who are dying in the United States are people of color, Black and brown. I believe that's right. Am I right, Pete? Or is it slightly higher? Whatever it is, there's a disproportionate number of people who are Black and brown who are dying. And the question is why? And in the group that I was a part of, some of the ideas that are being floated is that, genetics, they are predisposed to die or some nonsense like that. And that's absolutely not true. As somebody in my group pointed out, it has to do, one, with the kind of jobs that, Black and brown people do. They are a majority of essential workers, so they are being exposed far more often than others are. Second, it's health care inequality, right? We have a privatized for-profit healthcare system in this country. If you don't have access to healthcare, and testing is still not easily available, by the way, and hospital beds are completely jam-packed. People in New Jersey are talking about how if they fall sick, there is no hospital they can go to in their neighborhood because everyone is jam-packed. So there's access to healthcare, which is also having these outcomes. And certainly even before the coronavirus, we know that inadequate access to healthcare for poor and working class Black and brown people lead to greater deaths, preventable deaths, even under normal circumstances. And that's being played out even more with the coronavirus. But the last thing I'll say is also this, which is that racism actually gets into your body. That is to say, it makes you sick, right? If you have to live in a society where you're dehumanized constantly, your mental health has an impact on your physical health. And there's certainly enough research to suggest that this is the case. So there are pre-existing conditions such as heart disease or diabetes, which one can argue make Black and brown people more susceptible to death with the coronavirus, but these two are the products of living in a racist society. Will anti-Chinese racism be ramped up in the same way that Islamophobia was? Well, that depends. I mean, if there is something useful to be gained from enmity with China, for going to war with China and so on, absolutely. But China occupies this really interesting position on the global stage, right? At least in the case of US, much of the US debt, I don't know what percentage of it it is, but much of the bonds are held by the Chinese. So they have this antagonistic relationship. At the same time, they have to have cooperation with one another. So, you know, how much of this is going to turn into absolute warfare, we'll have to see. But certainly, at least from Obama's Pivot to Asia program, there's been a greater attempt to try to squash China before it can rise to being a real threat to US hegemony on the global stage. But and you know, certainly old ideas come back to furnish new racisms. There was also a question in my group about Islamophobia. And certainly there are tropes that go back all the way to the 12th century. This is when Islamophobia in Europe first begins. I'm actually doing a second edition of my Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire book. And right now I'm working on chapter 1, where I'm going through how, you know, certain notions of a violent Islam were developed in that context, and that, you know, sort of exist from then on. And it's very useful, right? Certainly in the case of the terrorists and so forth. But at the same time, I just want to dispel this notion that somehow the relationship between Europeans and their Near Eastern neighbors has always been hostile, right? The kind of clash of civilizations, Samuel Huntington rhetoric is absolutely false. If you read about the relationship between, for instance, Christians, Muslims, and Jews in Al-Andalus, in the Iberian Peninsula, you don't find that, right? You have intermarriages. I'm not saying there wasn't hostility or discrimination, but you have intermarriages, you have a good deal of sharing of scientific language and research, and, you know, particularly in the fields of astronomy, but also medicine. In fact, Europe could not have gone through the Renaissance had it not been for the work of the Arab scholars, both in the Abbasid Caliphate as well as in Al-Andalus. So the picture is really complicated. It's when ideas become useful to racialized groups, particularly for the political elite to advance an imperial agenda, that's when groups get racialized, right? That's the point. So in line with that, the question of colonialism is absolutely central to racial formation. I quickly sort of brushed through that part. My bad, I didn't have much time. But colonialism, modern colonialism, particularly the late 18th and then the 19th and early 20th century, lays the groundwork for the systematic dehumanization of people in Asia, the Chinese, the Indians, Africans, and so forth, to justify the plunder of resources, to justify the taking over of people's lands. You know, when you're talking about Algeria and South Africa and so forth. And so the point that Bridget made is absolutely right, which is that even before immigrants from you know, former colonial countries can come to the United Kingdom, they're already seen as racialized others. And the way that Asa Vinandan puts it is, you know, a sort of response that immigrants have had is, we are here because you were there, right? And so we're in the belly of the beast because you messed up our country. So anyway. Do you want to take some more?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. So next I've got Kareem, Carolina, and Fiaz. Kareem.
There we go. Okay, I should be unmuted. Thanks. So yeah, I'm a public health professional, and like Samina, I'm also a PhD student at Glasgow. It's interesting that Deepa mentioned about race and mental health, because that's exactly what my PhD is working on. So I like to have that. It's nice to see that connection there. My group, we actually had a lot of ideas generated, and I think our question is more to do with more of a theoretical angle. So we talked about racism as practices versus ideology, and we were trying to get a sense of if Deepa could maybe articulate more this idea of how fascist groups and neoliberal groups are both using racism, but are there distinct ways in which they're using racism in sort of to promote their own political agendas, given you would think that they are opposite sides of the political spectrum, but they're both using racism essentially in a way to get what they want. So we were hoping if we could get a bit more clarification on those. Are there distinct types of racisms, or are they sort of just using them similarly?
Thanks very much, Kareem. Carolina. You need to unmute yourself. I can unmute you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Carolina. I am connecting from Lima, Peru. I'm a master's in ethnicity and multiculturalism. I just finished it last year, but I'm back here now. We really loved the presentation. It was absolutely interesting. And we got like two questions. We would like to know more about them. So the first one is about the method. In whose interests do you think these Chinese constructions are making themselves? Like who is benefiting from them? And the second one was, it's very particular, it comes actually from me, and is that, can we say that the mestizo category could have been created for the same purposes as the white workers? Yeah, that would be it.
Thanks, Carolina. And
Thanks.
Fia. Are you there, Fiaz? Well, Deepa, why don't you come back on these questions first, and if Fiaz is still with us, he can come in after that.
Sure. I realize I forgot the question about the defeat of Arab nationalism. So very quickly, essentially coming out of World War II, the US is one of two superpowers on the world stage, and the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States is played out around the world. Arab nationalism, secular Arab nationalism, as represented by Nasser in Egypt or Mossadegh in Iran, these are the sort of key challenges to US geopolitical interests in the region. There were also communist parties that take all sorts of crazy positions because they're under the diktats of the Stalinist Comintern and then the Common Forum. So I won't go into that, but there is a left, there's a huge and vibrant socialist communist left and so on. By the time we come to the 70s, in various parts of the Middle East, the left is in decline, right? Starting first in Egypt, but then spreading elsewhere. Of course, Mossadegh is overthrown in '53 and so forth. And so the shape of anti-imperialist resistance gets replaced, right? By the time you go into the 1980s, after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, then the rise of Hamas in Palestine, the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and so on, resistance to US imperialism takes the form of Islamism. And this is the context really for the shift from the Arab terrorist to the Muslim terrorist, which is the dominant image today. So I think that was the question you were asking me, but that's, I hope that's at least a quick and short answer. My understanding of the first question was that fascist groups are using racism, as are liberal groups, correct? Or neoliberal groups, and what makes them distinct. I'll answer that in terms of Islamophobia again, which is that there is an international coalition of right-wing groups who have a very blatant form of anti-Muslim racism, right? They have all the most vile stereotype, and you know, that Muslim men are out to rape white Christian women, or that these people are prone to violence. They're like these Manchurian candidates and you have to lock them up immediately. And that, you know, Muslim women are these poor, oppressed, sad creatures. Why? Because they wear a hijab, right? I mean, one of the things about the turn towards Islam as a form of resistance in the Middle East is that it's also reflected in immigrants in the diaspora, where people turn to articles of religious clothing as a way to assert their resistance within societies that see them as an enemy. So there are all sorts of complex reasons why women wear the hijab and so forth. But nevertheless, the right has the most sort of base, vile stereotypes. Now that's not true of liberals and neoliberal groups, right? Because we live in supposedly a post-racial era. Racism is a thing of the past. And for the vast majority, this kind of ideology doesn't play nearly as well, particularly among liberal audiences. And so you think of the case of Obama, right? Obama, because his middle name was Hussein, was accused of being Muslim. And the way that he responded to that is to say, oh, no, I am Christian. I go to a church every Sunday, what have you, and so on, as if to say that there's something wrong with being Muslim, right? So liberal Islamophobia, liberal anti-Muslim racism is very murky in that sense. That is, the end result is the same. That is to delegitimize Islam, is to somehow cast aspersions on Muslims, but to do it in a way that actually sort of is very subtle and that bifurcates between the good Muslims, that is people we can work with and who are the agents of empire, and bad Muslims, those who we cannot control. And therefore it looks like, oh, so there is no essentialized Muslim race being created. And so this must be realistic, you know, and so it's not racism. So that's a quick answer. Finally, on method, who benefits from anti-Chinese racism? Essentially, the slightly longer history in this country, and just to show you sort of the hypocrisy, it has nothing to do with the shape of people's eyes that this racism is being produced, right? So if you look at the Second World War and after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, over 1 million people of Japanese descent in the United States are put into these concentration camps, are put into these makeshift places and interned and incarcerated. Vast majority of them US citizens, right? But as the US starts to develop, Japan as a loyal client to the United States, these stereotypes begin to go away, so much so that Ronald Reagan actually issues an apology to Japanese Americans in the late 1980s. But at the same time as Japan has been sort of quelled as a threat to US hegemony on the global stage, you start to see the rise of China. And in neoconservative circles, right from the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a sense in which this could be the next power that actually challenges US authority on the world stage, which is why Samuel Huntington, the Clash of Civilizations guy, actually not only targets the Islamic civilization as a threat to the West, but also the Chinese civilization, right? So stereotypes of Chinese, anti-Chinese propaganda comes into being at that point, because always when a nation is at war or is in competition with an outside force, those who represent those people within the nation are policed, are racialized, are targeted. This happens, by the way, to Germans as well during the First World War, right? The US is at war, goes into the First World War, and Germans are also targeted in this sort of way. So that's the longer history. Now the question is, given the global integration economically of China with Europe and so on, it makes the situation slightly complicated, and I can't predict. I don't study US relations with China, so I can't predict where this is going to lead and whether it's going to actually rise to the level of Islamophobia.
Thanks so much, Deepa. And Fiaz, I saw, was still with us.
Sorry, I think my microphone was muted, so I couldn't come through to you. I'm from West Yorkshire, urban districts of West Yorkshire, and as Samina mentioned earlier, some of the health inequalities are quite significant for our locality. And Samina kindly shared the Zoom link, so it's my first content meeting I'm participating in. The question from our group was, what does it mean for abolishing racism in 21st century, following on the works of sisters some 30 years ago, when currently race is a significant issue for some people?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I don't think I understood.
What does it mean to abolish race in 21st century?
Okay.
Particularly when it seems to be, well, in practical terms, and certainly it's a significant issue for most people currently, and in terms of revisiting the work of sisters some 30 years ago, the academic work.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Deepa, do you want to respond to that question, and also use this time to just sum up with any closing remarks that you'd like to make, including the whole discussion?
Sure. So what does it mean to end or abolish racism in the 21st century? Wow, that's a, that's a huge task, isn't it? That is, if we understand that the processes by which people are turned into racism are rooted within structures, within unjust and unequal structures, then what it means to end racism is to actually dismantle those structures, right? And so what that takes, and what that's going to take, is solidarity between people of different so-called racialized groups, participating in every form of struggle that they can. Right now, to block with our East Asian brothers and sisters against the racist hate crimes that they are experiencing, right? It means white people putting themselves out in front of the fascists, the right-wingers, and protecting, to the extent that we could, in socially distant ways. I don't even know what that means, but both in social media as well as in the real world, fighting against acts of racism that we may see, East Asian-looking people facing. I mean, I have friends who are like, I don't want to go to the grocery store because I don't know who's going to do something to me. Just yesterday, an East Asian scientist was shot and killed. And so it's a scary time to be East Asian looking and be in the United States right now. So very immediately, blocking against that and doing what we can, both in terms of solidarity statements with our brothers and sisters, but also organizing in other ways is important. But in the big scheme of things, I really think that dismantling capitalism is the only way that we can actually put an end to racism. Because, I mean, you think about slavery, right? Slavery ended. And then a new form of slavery started up with sharecropping in the South. There's a book called Slavery by Another Name. And then you think about what happens to African Americans around housing. There's a certain practice called redlining, where they're not allowed to buy in white-only areas, and they're forced to buy houses in areas where the value does not go up. And there's a really great book by Kianga Yamhata Taylor, who's a good friend of mine. It's called Race for Profit, which is about how the banking industry, the mortgage industry, that they're both the same, of course, the insurance industry and the government, the FHA, actually colluded to, to make massive profits from African Americans through a kind of housing scheme that would then impoverish African Americans even more, right? So both at the point of production, where Black people are paid less than their white counterparts, but also in the space of social reproduction, in housing and your ability to live, they face expropriation, exploitation, and so forth. So all these venues become spaces where we can struggle, where we can resist, and at the very least, try to undo these practices in the here and now, but with a recognition that in the long term, capitalism is a system that relies on systematic inequalities, that relies on exploitation of domestic as well as international labor, and will use racialization to extract the maximum profits and to divide people.